there was one character, a strip or storyline called the Legion of Superheroes, and these were teenagers with superpowers, but they were from the future. So these teenagers in the future, and Superboy becomes one of them. In any case, one of these characters is called Cosmic Boy. And I didn't understand why he was called Cosmic Boy. And one of the other ones was called Lightning Lad, and that he shot lightning bolts, so that made sense. And there's Saturn Girl. I'm not quite sure why Saturn had anything to do with telepathy. That tends to be what the girls get to do. But this guy, Cosmic Boy, he had magnetic powers. And I approached it very logically, and I wondered, well, why isn't he called Magnet Boy or Magnetic Boy? So I asked my sister, and she didn't know. My mother didn't know. And I didn't bother to ask my father. So you could say, in a way, I've been trying to figure what cosmic means ever since.
Few members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame are also respected authorities on the Western inner tradition. Gary Lachman is one of them. In 1978, as Gary Valentine of Blondie, he wrote the hit, "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear." Inspired by shared dreams and telepathic experiences with his girlfriend, that moment ignited a lifelong exploration of consciousness. In his memoir, Touched by the Presence, Gary traces his journey from punk rock's epicenter on New York's Bowery to the worlds of occultism, philosophy, and esoteric thought. Along the way, he encounters culture icons like Debbie Harry and David Bowie, to Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, while immersing himself in traditions such as Gnosticism, the Golden Dawn, and the Fourth Way. The result is a witty, insightful account of a seeker's path from rock and roll to individuation. Welcome back and welcome to the show, Gary.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me on.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show, and especially with the launch of your new book, Touched by the Presence. So this is a spin-off of a song that you wrote.
Well, that's the title. The title comes from a song I wrote quite some time ago when I was a musician in New York in the 1970s. I was in a band called Blondie. It's sort of common knowledge. And the song was about these strange telepathic and shared dream experiences my girlfriend and I were having. And this happened in 1977 during Blondie. We did our first North American tour. We were the support act for Iggy Pop. So if you know your rock and roll, Iggy Pop was, famous wild man of, still is, famous wild man of rock and roll, kind of grandfather of punk rock and so on. So it was quite, prestigious thing to do this. And Lisa had a list of all the hotels. Lisa Jane Persky was my girlfriend at the time, my oldest and best friend now. And she was an actress, well, still is, writer and chronicler and photographer of this time. And she had a list of the hotels. And so she would know where I was. And it turned out that whenever she wanted to call me, say I was in Chicago or whatever, I would want to telephone her, or I was about to pick up the phone, something along those kinds of lines. And then we seemed to have the same sorts of dreams. I can't now remember exactly what the dreams were about, but that was the thing. And so when at the end of that tour, in between the end of that tour and going on another tour to the UK, here, where I now live, for the first time, I wrote this song called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," about these sorts of experiences. And as I often say, I think it's the only song that was in the top 10 that has the word theosophy in the lyrics. Not that I'm a theosophist, but it's part of the rhyme, part of the lyrics. And so this book takes that title or that song as it's an allusion to that song. Because in a way that was the first foray of myself writing about sorts of things that I would subsequently write books about. So the first thing I wrote about, the sort of thing I've been writing books about now for almost 30 years since I've been in London, the first attempt is a song. And so this book is fundamentally about how I became a writer. In a more narrow sense, it's how I went from playing in rock bands in my 20s to uh, when I hit 40, leaving Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, to come to these shores. So that's a spoiler. That's the end. But that sets up for a part two if this one does well. I'll carry on with what happened when I arrived here 30 years ago, if this book sells decently enough. Um, but so the touch by the presence is the notion of how I went from playing in bands, but actually fulfilling what was a longer kind of dream or some I don't know what do you want to call it, kind of desire to be was to write. And so that's what the book is about. So it begins basically when I'm about 5 years old, when I
Yes.
first start reading. And then, as I said already, it ends when I'm getting on a plane at LAX to come here
Hmm.
at 40.
And so back when you were 5 years old, you had an obsession. You might call it an obsession. Do you want to talk to the audience about your comic book sort of obsession and how that ended you sort of leading you on your way
Hmm.
to where you are today, basically?
Yeah, because I mean, I didn't know this at the time when I was 5 years old, but I was, no, completely, taken with them. And I subsequently came to think that, um, again, many of the ideas or themes or kind of notions that I subsequently came to write about uh, are there in these early comic books that I was reading. And I say I was 5 years old. Um, that would have been 1961 because my birthday's coming up, as a matter of fact, and shortly I'll be 70 on Christmas Eve. Hold on, knocking on wood with any luck. So yeah, my birthday's Christmas Eve. So it was at the end of the year. So I was born in 1955. But it's kind of like you might as well have been born, early 56.
Yes.
So any case, I know that I was that young when I was reading these comic books because I can remember when they went from being 10 cents, the price, to 12 cents. And this happened at the end of 1961. And I tell the story in the book about there's a favorite character of mine called the Flash. He's the fellow who can, run very, very fast and all that sort of thing. And I was with my grandmother, and I asked her if I could have a dime, 10 cents for a comic book. And she wasn't that happy, giving it to me. But and two things came of it though. She gave me the dime, and then she also said she cautioned me. She said, "Don't get one you already have," which suggests that I already had a collection of them. Right. So already by that time I had some, and I went to the shop, and I hadn't noticed on the cover the copy of the Flash I got, and I gave the fellow the dime. And he said, "No, I'm sorry, they got on to 12 cents."
Mm.
So I had to go back and get another 2 cents, which is, you have to struggle for what's really important in life. You have to really, really struggle and fight. So I had to get that, and then so that yeah, that says I was that young and already had some. Um, and you can say a more kind of direct way. There was one character. There was one uh, strip or storyline called the Legion of Superheroes, and these were teenagers with superpowers, but they were from the future. It was strange because it predated the X-Men, which became the kind of teenage superpower ones and all that. But these was like it was DC Comics, and everything's kind of nice in that world at that time. There was no conflict or anything like that. So these teenagers in the future, and Superboy becomes one of them. Any case, one of these characters is called Cosmic Boy. And I didn't understand why he was called Cosmic Boy. One of the other ones was called Lightning Lad, and that he shot lightning bolts, so that made sense. And there's Saturn Girl. I'm not quite sure why Saturn had anything to do with telepathy, but that tends to be what the girls get to do in those comics, and they have like mental kind of powers and that sort of thing. So, but this guy, Cosmic Boy, he had magnetic powers. And I approached it very logically, and I wondered, well, why isn't he called Magnet Boy? or magnetic boy? Like what is cause what's so I asked my sister and she didn't know. She was sister's a few years older than me. My mother didn't know, and I didn't bother to ask my father. And so you could say, in a way, I've been trying to figure what cosmic means ever since.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so you spent years purchasing comic books and reading them. And how do you feel that that sort of set you on a path to explore more areas of your life?
I mean, one of the things is that it's just, I mean, I said, teenagers with superpowers in the future. I mean, you
Hmm.
don't get that in everyday life.
Yes.
So it's these alternative realities, and also, well, in a way, I mean, it's something many years later. I wrote an essay, an article about you could see these superheroes as kind of models of self-actualization. You know, if you
Yes.
know Abraham Maslow's notion of self-actualization. So, in some ways, these are characters that through different kind of trials or whatever challenges they manifest aspects of themselves that are beyond the ordinary and the everyday and something like that. And I mean, even at an early age, I remember I remember at one time I don't remember how old I was, but being asked, what did I want to be when I grew up? And my sister immediately said, "And you can't be a superhero, Superman." And I said, like, well, why not? Why can't I be? But that was sort of like, in a way, that was supposed to dampen my enthusiasm, but it did nothing more than increase it. But no, it's these kind of I think they're positive role models. I mean, these again, just remember when I'm reading them, this is what's known as the sort of silver age of comics. So this is late 50s into the early 1960s, and then that throughout the 1960s, and then it kind of changes. It gets darker, but like as everything did in the
Hmm.
70s and things of that sort. And by that time, I was in a different sort of sensibility, so I wasn't reading them anymore. So contemporary, I didn't get into contemporary graphic novels and things of that sort. And although what did happen when my sons were younger in the
Hmm.
2000s, they were still boys. They didn't become readers. They're victims of the digital age. But I
Yes.
did initiate them into sort of superhero lore through the films and but also the action figures, which are they're not collecting dust, but they're in a box somewhere in the closet now. So they'll be worth something on eBay at some point. But so I introduced them through. There was a wonderful series on the Cartoon Network, the Justice League, and the people who did that, they really knew their stuff, and it was like it's better than any of the films, anything like that. So through a period, say 20 years ago, more or less, kind of I went back into it with them to introduce them to these kind of figures because they're positive role models, and I actually wrote a couple of articles for the there's the Times Educational Supplement, which is a prestigious excuse me, supplement to the Sunday Times here on the superheroes as positive role models. So I see them as that sort of thing. And for me in my own life, it was the first introduction to a wider world than the everyday one.
Yes. When you left home, where did you end up going? And what were you in search of or for?
Well, when I left home, I mean, there's a whole kind of tragic story, which I won't go into here,
Oh.
that precipitated leaving home. But I did in the early 1970s, about 73, when I was 18. Wound up leaving home and first living in New York. And well, I grew up, as I said, I grew up I was a kid in the 60s. I hit my teens in the 70s. And I grew up in New Jersey. It wasn't too far from New York, just the Hudson River. So it was a short, bus ride, or, they have these sort of underground trains that go into the river. You can get over there and all that. And when I was growing up, it was the tail end of the 60s sort of sensibilities, don't conform and do your own thing and so on and so on, and the drug culture and all of that, and obviously rock music and all that. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is I can remember when I first went to university or college. What I remember most is in the quad, the Pink Floyd album, Dark Side of the Moon, being played constantly. on the college radio station than, clouds of marijuana smoke. And so it's not quite that today, but that was sort of, that was sort of, taken for granted kind of. And so that was the atmosphere. And but I had at some point, from me reading the comics and I started just reading books. I mean, I was an inveterate reader. So a romantic or escapist, you could say. The world of reading of books was a complete, utter world to the world I grew up in, which was the world that most, many people, blue collar, you got one on now, right? A blue collar family. My parents were not particularly well read or educated or that sort of thing, but hard workers, and he's had like 2 or 3 jobs all the time, and all that sort of thing. And they're from the generation of the 40s and so on. And there really was what was called the generation gap, which you don't quite have now, but that was like, there was this fissure between that generation and the people older than me, the real 60s radicals, but then the up and coming, adolescents who were, coming of age in that sort of milieu, and the anti-war marches and civil war. I mean, what I can see from here, America is more divisive than it was then, but it was very divisive back then. And there was this whole sense of, sort of eruption and everything. But I mean, I at some point, I don't know, I wanted to become a poet. I don't know where they came from. I don't understand where any of that sort of came from. And I wrote, I wrote poetry. I mean, it was pretty bad, but I did it. I mean, there's a little bit, a tiny little bit I indulged at one point in the book in a footnote. I put in a little kind of Weltschmerz, poetry. I mean, yeah. I mean, when you're a teenager, like death and all that, it's like, it's so fantastic. You're always thinking about death and doom and everything's dreary and meaninglessness. And so I went through that kind of period and all that. And, luckily outgrew that. But one point, just prior to my winding up playing in Blondie, I was living in it was literally a storefront that someone had transformed into a studio. I'm sharing this with this very, very radical fellow, and this is on, if you know New York, in 1974 into 75. This is East 10th Street between First Avenue and Avenue A. Nowadays, that Avenue A, B, C, and D, it's Alphabet City. I mean, it's a kind of, overpriced yuppie, area. But back then it was no man's land. It was really, the negative zone. You didn't go down that way. So it was, it was at a time when that kind of neck of the woods was a bit more dangerous than it is now. And I was, literally starving. I mean, I tell stories about how I'm like, shoplifting and, taking cigarette butts out of secretaries' ashtrays when I was working as a messenger and earning just enough money to pay my share of the rent on this place. And I'm reading a lot and reading Henry Miller and reading existentialism. And I don't know if you know New York, there's this fantastic bookshop that's still there called The Strand. And it's like 8 miles of books, and it's a huge secondhand or remainder, books. In any case, I'm rambling, but that was sort of the thing. I mean, I would spend a lot of time there, and they had the cheap, like 25-cent rack out there, and you could get, whatever, some book by Sartre or Camus or something. And then, but it was in that kind of context that the drummer, the fellow who wound up playing in Blondie, he was also from my hometown in Jersey, Bayonne. Clem Berg, and sadly he passed away earlier this year. Oh. But I knew him from high school, and he was a drummer in the bands in high school. But he had started playing with them, and this was before anybody was anything. They weren't and they had lost their bass player, and I wasn't really a musician, but I could kind of fake it and pretend enough to get by at this point, because it was that kind of music. It was very simple.
But you had a bass. But you had a bass guitar.
I didn't have anything. No, I didn't. I know. I was starving. I mean, I was living in this place, starving. Right. I mean, there's a whole story about the guy who was living by itself, which is I don't know if there's a famous British movie called Withnail and I, about these two. They're not quite punks, but they're in that realm here in England, and it's incredibly wild and squalid and all. And so I was living in something like that with this guy who later became, strangely enough, he became like the head of a born again Christian cult somewhere. So it's like that whole thing I should have turned into fiction, but I just said no. This is my life. Actually, this is what happened. But I was in that context, and then I wound up auditioning for them for the fledgling Blondie, and then okay, fine. So then my life changed there. So I just turned 19 at that point and started playing, but I became homeless because the guy threw me out of the place. Because for whatever, and I couldn't. And I went home for a brief period, but my parents understandably weren't that keen on me coming in at 4 a.m. after like playing, and that kind of thing. So it was either, quit the band or, and go back to college or, good luck. So I took the good luck route, and and I wound up. Debbie Harry very kindly. She had she must have been desperate to keep the band going. When I think about it, is that she had a small 1-bedroom flat in Little Italy, which was a backwater then. It's it's a tourist haven now, but it was kind of just off the beaten track of Greenwich Village then. And she was living there with Chris Stein, who's guitarist, and she basically took me in after I was homeless for a bit. And then at that was only a temporary thing. It was too small. And then we wound up moving into this loft space on the Bowery, about a block away from the club CBGB.
And then what happened after that?
That's a good question. And then what happened after that? Well, I mean, I was just living with them. But this is the point in the book where the rock and roll milieu and my introduction to sort of thing I subsequently wound up writing about, magic and the occult and esotericism. This is where it takes place, because this is where I was introduced to all, or at least first learn of this sort of thing. I mean, I was always reading things, but I didn't have any interest in magic or anything like that, except in weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft, or in the great classic horror films from the 30s and 40s, which I saw on television when I was a kid, but nothing seriously. And but in this place we were living in on the Bowery, there was a fellow there who basically had the lease insofar there was anything like that on this building. And he was this wild, gay, flamboyant artist who was into the Hells Angels and all of this strange kind of stuff, leather jacketed and lion maned and tall and cackling laugh and all that. But he was very much into Aleister Crowley and his kind of magic and things of that sort. And he would do these sort of impromptu tarot readings with the Crowley Thoth deck, which it was still relatively rare then. And
not sleight of hand magic, but
no, I mean ceremonial magic, not tricks. I mean, magic is the science of art of calling change to occur with conformity of will. So basically, making things happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whether it actually works or not, that's a whole other thing. Yes. But I mean, Crowley was, he's very well known now. I mean, even then he was kind of a rock figure. He had already been on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's a generation earlier. When I was a kid in '67, Sgt. Pepper's, this famous Beatles album, that the psychedelic album, and changed the course of music and so on. But on the cover, Aldous Huxley's on the cover, C.G. Jung, but also Aleister Crowley. And no, he was a wild tearaway. Took drugs and was polymorphously perverse, and and so on and so on. Broke all the taboos, but he took his magic seriously, and so on and so on. So I just was introduced to this whole world, and he had his own sort of philosophy and everything, religion, and it was all new to me. But what really got me going on it was a book by a British writer, Colin Wilson, excuse me. It's just called The Occult, and it
Yes.
came out in 1971, and I read it in 75. And I didn't know. I mean, Wilson had a career the past 15 years up to then writing about things like existentialism and psychology and mystical states and things of that sort. So he brought this kind of focus to um, uh, this history of the occult, going like from the ancient shamans to contemporary times. And it wasn't a book just of spells and all that kind of stuff, which I wouldn't have been interested in. But he had a, I should say, it was page turners. I mean, it's still a wonderfully readable book. It's
Mm-hmm.
probably a bit dated. It's like it came out 50 years ago, just like myself. But it came out into the world. Not I came out 70 years ago. But but in any case, but it says he had a wonderful page turning style narrative, and the ideas were gripping. And again, I was 19 years old, and I was just completely taken with it. Not only the stories of these strange characters like Crowley and Madame Blavatsky and Gurdjieff and Rasputin and Nostradamus and so on, but also his ideas about the mind and consciousness and how magic is somehow about, powers of the mind and so on. So I just was completely taken with that. And so I just started reading as much of it that I could find at the time, and it was a wonderful time to do that because there was a resurgence of interest in all this sort of thing, starting in the 1960s, but carrying on through the 70s. I mean, still today, it's established as a kind of, it's a genre.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the strange new thing that it was 50 years ago. But all, bookshops had sections and of dedicated to this sort of thing. And there was the wonderful bookshop Weiser's in New York, in Cooper Union, which isn't there anymore, and they were a publisher too. So it just was a great time to become interested in because there was lots of stuff there. So it became, while I was becoming a musician, really, and this band Blondie was coalescing into a serious, creative force, as it were, subsequently to get a record deal with actually with one of my songs first, and so on and so on. So I, at the same time I was doing, I was reading all this kind of stuff. So the two things were carrying on in parallel.
Yeah, so you must have found that your growth really sped up when you started being introduced to all of this occult teachings and all of that type of stuff, because it really opens the mind. And is that when you started to write, or were you writing before then? You
No,
started to
no, no.
write?
I didn't write. I mean, what I was writing then, I was writing songs then.
Yeah, that's what I mean, writing,
But I mean, no,
writing.
no. Well, as soon as I started playing Blondie, I started writing songs
Hmm.
because that was the wonderful thing about what was happening there in New York. It was a response, a reaction to the sort of top heaviness that rock had become sort of afflicted with, I would say. Or like prog rock bands, progressive rock bands like Yes and King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and these like huge, Wagnerian operatic kinds of things, Tommy, and it seemed to have lost its roots in the simple rock and roll. And one thing that doesn't get mentioned that much in this context, and I always do mention it, is that just prior to what was happening in New York in the early 70s, when I was still in high school, there was a nostalgia for the roots of rock and roll.
Hmm.
There was a band called Sha Na Na that did all the old doo-wop songs. And the guys from the 50s, like Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and others were having revivals. And even people like John Lennon was writing songs about like getting back to the roots of rock and roll and all this kind of thing. So there was a reaction to all this very, again, not to, dismiss it, but it was the sort of thing I could never play. But I knew people, this is one of the reasons it's ironic that I went on and had, this career in music. Because I knew many people in my hometown that were these fantastic guitarists and fantastic musicians and all that, and they could listen to very complex passages
Yeah.
in these prog rock bands and duplicate them. But there's no way I could ever do that. But I could hit an A chord and I could hit a D chord. And when you get that other one that goes the next one, oh man, there you go. So because I had no preconceptions of like, oh, I'm not good enough. I just wow. So, I could do that. And that's in many ways what was happening in New York there is that it was very simple. The musicianship was simple, but it was raw and it was alive. And
Yes.
in this dive on the Bowery CBGB, and there's bands like Patti Smith and the Ramones, the Talking Heads, Television, and Blondie was one of the others who were, in a way, they weren't fully formed, and bang, here you are. That's entertainment. They're like becoming themselves up on the
Yes.
stage. So I mean, I was growing in that way because I went from. No, I said I blossomed as I would say, myself and my personality. Insofar as I have one, and it's worth blossoming. But when I
Yes.
started playing with them, because it's kind of, I mean, I can remember overcoming stage fright. I remember the first gig I did, I had my back and then overcame that. And then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, that they want you to be up on stage, and they're happy that you're up there. And once and I became very happy to be up on stage. I became quite accustomed to it, and it carries over in today when I do live talks. And not that I'm entertaining and all that kind of stuff, but I don't feel at all kind of uncomfortable being in front of people and talking and all that. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I
Hmm.
mean, and I guess as I started reading more of these books, I became more consciously thinking about, what you said,
Yeah.
development and evolution and all that kind of, but, again, as 19, 20-year-old would, not as, we might today, mature years and having gone through many, many things and understand it in different contexts. But it was more like, yeah, oh, yeah, of course, yeah, yeah, I want that. I want that super psychic power, whatever it might be, or whatever that thing might be. I want that. And I also want to write another good song. And so it was very high energy for me, and all these ideas about the possibilities of consciousness that fundamentally these different books about magic and the occult and paranormal and a variety of different things, I was reading, but that was kind of the back, I mean, what are you going to say? Kind of the back story, the back narrative. That was sort of the idea behind all of those things.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we don't know, and we don't even know how to ask the questions to get to where we want to know. And so it was really interesting that you were introduced to that at still such an early age. I mean, some people aren't searching for meaning until a certain age or whatever.
Mm.
And and you tend to do it early in your life so that you had a really great background in order for you to self-actualize, really, being a musician and then on to being a prolific writer.
Well, I think the first kind of serious, in a sense, again, I was even younger, but
Okay.
serious. So it was when I was introduced to Hermann Hesse. I was one of the many million of adolescent Hesse fatalities in the States. When he had this remarkable posthumous bestseller success in the English-speaking world. So I mean, it started in the '60s, but by the time some a hippie girl I had a crush on gave me a copy of Siddhartha in 1970 when I was 14, and that was like the first serious kind of literature. I was reading all science fiction and horror and weird fiction and stuff like that, but this was the first kind of serious fiction I was reading, and from there I just went on to read all of those. And so I talk about that in the book too, and the whole idea, sort of becoming who you are. I
Yes.
mean, Hesse was picked up by the '60s generation because he's writing back in the '20s and about, not conforming and discovering who you are.
Yes.
And for me, novels like, the Siddhartha, then Damien was the great, one to read when you're a certain age, teenager, because it's about coming of age and subsequently, I mean, for me, it led me on to Jung, and because he's talking about things like Abraxas and Gnosticism and all the stuff that again I'm reading. So what is that all about? And so one thing led to another and another. So I mean, I don't know, for some reason that all of that really, I guess I took it seriously, I mean, or,
Mhm.
I, what do you want to call it? Like a naive idealist, that subsequently it became, some, I mean, I don't know if I'm more actualized than anybody else, but I understand the context and all of that. And I have
Mhm.
done what I wanted to do in the sense that I felt, that's what the book is about. The book is about, at the end, my setting off to come here and become the writer. I mean, by the end of the book, I've written articles and things like that, but there's a complete change in my life, and I won't go too much detail about that. But it's this dramatic kind of boom, and everything is different. And
Mhm.
but I'm set off on this, adventure here, to do that. And it's, I mean, it's like Jung says. He says you sort of individuation kind of begins after 40.
Mhm.
After you've, at least that kind of.
Mhm.
That sort of narrative where you established yourself, I mean, I didn't have children until after 40, but I already, you've been in the real
Yeah.
world, you've had a career, you've done X, Y, and Z, and now that you have the midlife crisis, and what do you do with your life now, and all that sort of thing. And for me, it was sink or
Mhm.
swim. So I had this career for a good 7 years in music, from about 75 to about 82. Blondie, my own band, and then I played with Iggy Pop for
Yeah,
two
it's
North
awesome.
American tours. And then I dropped out. I lost interest. Basically, I didn't get a deal with my own band, the No, and I was reading too much. I was getting too smart. And well, I couldn't write songs anymore. Once I couldn't write songs
Right.
anymore, I didn't want to just play guitar. And I have to
Yes.
say, honestly, I mean, I was never a great guitarist in that sense, that I could just get by being a guitarist in a band. I could do my own stuff, but I was I just didn't want to play other people's music. I mean, I could do it, and I did it, but I
Yeah.
didn't want to do that. So, and I just
Mhm.
decided, okay. I mean, the smart worldly thing would have been to like consolidate your place here in the rock world and somehow stay in this, because this, you've already established yourself as something there. But that drive to self-actualize, whatever you call it, to be creative, to follow your destiny, whatever. I didn't want to do it anymore,
Mhm.
and it was a good 10 years from deciding, okay, I'm dropping out of this, to when I started to actually just start write book reviews and things like that. So I mean, I sort of jokingly call it the wilderness, but I tried to find a place in the real world,
Mhm.
and I took a decade to do that, and at the end of it, no,
Mhm. That, to self-actualize your journey, your mission, I mean, it takes courage. I know that a lot of people, and you know yourself, there's a lot of people that take their dreams to the grave with them because they didn't have the courage, they didn't have the support, they didn't have those things. But people that must do what they came here to do will take chances, and in order for them to be who they came here to be. And so when you left music, you went from one genre to another.
Oh yeah, I did that. I mean,
Yeah.
I had the great good fortune to live off my royalties for a couple of years, and but my career move after that was to I got a degree in philosophy,
Hmm.
and I thought I was going to do. I was going to teach philosophy, which my everyone I knew thought I was crazy, especially the philosophy professors. At the university I went to, they said when they discovered I used to play in rock bands, they said, "My God, why do you want to do this? It's absolutely boring. I mean, how could you?" But I was serious. I wanted to understand it. So I'd gone from
Yes.
reading, you could say, haphazardly, indiscriminately, lots of things. You say, okay, and I thought I would go on to teach it. Oddly enough, at the same time as roughly around the same time that I started that track, I started working at a very well-known, at the time, New Age bookshop in
Hmm.
Los Angeles called the Bodhi that had been there since the 70s. I started working there in 87. I think I worked there 87 to 93, so I was there for 6 years. And it was sort of the height of the New Age, and I don't know if you remember something that was called the harmonic convergence that
Mhm.
went on in '87, and then the denouement of that was supposed to be 2012, but the Quetzalcoatl coming back and things of that sort. So, but yeah, so I'm studying Wittgenstein and Plato and Aristotle, and then I'm talking to people about their auras and you know showing them how to do the I Ching and things of that sort. So I had this in a way. I mean, that I think subsequently fed into how I write. I'm kind of like a little bit of both world in there, trying to find some
Mhm.
way to accommodate both. The rationality inside the anything goes kind of world, and a bit more kind of what should we say, openness and adventure in the rational sort of world. And it's I think where those two things come together, maybe you could say left and right brain or something like that. I mean, I think that's one way you could look at what. Again, I don't sort of heavy pedal that, but it is some. At one point, I say, "Oh, I was trying to go from a right brain to a left." They went from playing rock and roll, jumping around, writing songs, lyric poetry. Now I'm like studying philosophy, and. But for a while, it became insufferable because I was so like keen on being, keenly analytical and thinking very clearly, and I was completely insufferable. I was asked to leave social gatherings because I was telling people they didn't know what they were talking about, and things like that. So not the best way to get friends, but I was, this was this overcompensation perhaps for my attempt to take on this philosophical thing. But even that, I went a certain distance with that, and then that changed too.
Mhm.
So.
Well, the wonderful thing about it is you were okay with those changes. You know,
Yeah, I didn't have much choice. It was either that or what are you going to do? Give up? Sit down?
yeah,
I'm not taking this anymore. I'm sick and
yeah.
tired. I'm not going to take it anymore. You have explosions like that, but you still, after all that's said and done,
Uh-huh.
unless you blow your brains out, you have to sort of face it. So, no, but it was a do or die situation. It led in the end. I mean, um, no, I had an attempt to have an academic career.
Hmm.
The last thing I did in that context was work as a science writer
Hmm.
for University of California in Los Angeles. It was a job I should never have had because I had no background in science. My academic background was philosophy and, excuse me, English and things of that sort, humanities. But I had written some book reviews about pop science books on complexity and chaos theory and things of that sort that were very popular at the time, and articles as such. And I'm jumping, ahead quite a bit, but I had become married. I mean, that was one of the things that involved with someone at the bookshop, and we subsequently became married. And instead of my going on to, I had intended to go and do graduate study in philosophy, but that would have meant going to the East Coast. I decided to stay, and I briefly started a PhD track in English at USC, but that didn't last very long. It was a complete fish out of water. And so the last thing I did was, um, again, I got a surprise royalty check, and I was sort of living on that for a while, trying to write a novel. And understandably, my wife at the time was not happy um, with my being a house husband and frittering away this windfall and trying to write a novel that most likely no one's ever going to publish anyway. You need a job. So I came up with this idea that I would apply for jobs I would never get. But I've been missing one little thing. I could almost get it, but and so she had seen an ad in the Los Angeles Times that UCLA needed a science writer. So she said, you should apply for this. And I thought, great, I'll never get it. I have no science background. But I'll just send them some stuff. They'll see it's just pop science stuff. This guy. But then they said, when do you want to start?
Oh.
So I actually got the job and I outsmarted myself. So I got this job I didn't want. It was a very, very well-paying job. And anybody else would have thought it was great. I was like, oh God, I got to do this now. I can't back out of it. It was very well-paying. Secretary, my own office, all that kind of jazz, all that
You'd
stuff.
arrived.
Oh yeah, I mean, okay, here's the real world, and it's not, you're using your mind, you're not, I mean, the science part, I mean, the real boring stuff is writing grant proposals and things like that. But what they wanted was someone who could put together a newsletter, which I did to communicate to the alumni the wonderful advances in the microbiology department in language that they could understand and other things like that. So it was fun, it was, I thought, okay. But it was sort of like, well, I remember walking across the campus and thinking, well, maybe you're not going to be the writer you wanted to be, but this is good, isn't it? You got a well-paying job, da 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 da. You're still relatively young, and yada yada yada, that kind of thing. Trying to convince myself, but um, no, at some point, just from deep down inside, this came up. No, you're not happy. You can pretend to be happy. You can do all the things. You could, get away with it, but you're not happy, and you're not going to be happy. This isn't what you want to do. And so I don't know if that set things in motion, but after that, everything fell apart. Um, Marriage fell apart. I fell apart. I
Mhm.
lost a job because I fell apart, so and so on. So everything broke down. Everything melted down. So it's a real Negredo, if you want to talk alchemically, everything really collapsed. And I was, I don't know if I was clinically depressed, but I was certainly in a bad way for several months, a couple months at least. And but that was the beginning. I mean, that led to it's sort of long story, but that led to my meeting people on a holiday uh, in Europe and then in England,
Mhm.
and who basically said, if you want to change the scenery, come here for a while. You hang out with us. We'll put you up, that kind of thing. So I went back to LA and I decided, okay, that's what I'll do. And so at the end of 1995, uh, well, the beginning of 1996, January 1, 1996, I got on a plane LAX to come here. So again, that's a spoiler. That's where the book that's where the book ends. But again, if it does well, I promise I'll write the sequel about like, what happened after that.
How many books have you written and published?
Well, this is the 26th
The
that's
20s.
published. I actually have one with one of my publishers um, that's due next year at some point. So
Okay.
yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, it's necessity is the mother of production. I mean, I'm one of these writers who they're always saying they need a break, and as soon as you don't have any work, you have no idea what to do with yourself,
Okay.
and so you're like, so. But I'm no, I'm busy. I'm putting together a 4-part course for the Philosophical Research Society
Right.
in Los Angeles. It's an online course. It'll be in February, and it's about ancient Alexandria, a city of
Okay.
sects and gospels, and it's a place sort of the kind of the roots of Western esoteric tradition in many ways. It comes out of there. So you have Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and this kind of I don't quite know what to call it, a kind of early pre-Roman church, Roman Christianity
Okay.
there that was very, very different than what ultimately became what we know as, the church. But yeah, so working on that. And but I have to say, this book, I mean, I didn't plan to write this memoir. It just sort of happened. And again, um, for the very reason I said that I was I had finished the book. I had time on my hands. I can't go into any detail about it, but I say at the end, if you get to the acknowledgments, I wrote this book to keep sane. Because it was a very difficult time in my life at the time. And there's this strange circularity about it. I say the book ends with my leaving Los Angeles to become here at the beginning of January. I started writing the book in January of 2023, and I ended it in January 2024. So I began it and ended it at 2 anniversaries of the very thing that the book ends on, if in a strange kind of way. So there is these kind of circles within circles. But I just sat down. I I was camping out, as it were. There's the British Library, which is this wonderful resource here.
Yes.
It's this fantastic open research center, and you can bring your laptop and get a desk and so on and so on. So I was there, and I just started. I had to do something. I didn't have any work to do, and I just said, okay, well, this is how I started the book. People often ask me, how did I go from, you know, being a rock star? So, but actually, I never was a star. So I was more of a satellite. I was really a rock star. But if they think if you're in a rock band, you're a rock star. I don't claim the kind of celebrity that many of the people I was around certainly had. But to doing what I do now, writing these books, well, this memoir will be an attempt to do that. So I just took it from there. And it's the first book I wrote without being asked to write something. I mean, usually you pitch an idea.
Right.
You have an idea, and at least with me, it's like, okay, one of my editors, are you interested in this? And they say, oh, sounds good. Give us an outline, blah, blah, blah. This I just wrote. And I didn't know in the end because it's a memoir. It's one of those books that would be hard. Where do you put this in the bookshop? Because this guy was a musician, and now he's a writer, and he writes about all this weird kind of thing, but this is autobiography. I mean, that was the terror when I worked at a bookshop. That was the terror of a book. If you didn't know where to put it in a
Yeah.
bookshop, it was like, where do you find it? So this is a book like that because it covers a lot of areas. It's music, it's pop culture, it's uh,
Hmm.
new age and occult and so on and so on. But no, that was just, I just decided to do that and say, well, let's see what happens. And so I basically wrote it for myself. And at
Right.
the end, I asked an editor at one of my publishers. I said, look, I'm not necessarily submitting this, but I respect your judgment. I just was curious, if you take a look at it and let me know what you think. And he really liked it. So that's how, it subsequently came out. And my very good friend, Lisa Jane Persky, whose presence I'm in touch with
Hmm.
ages ago and still am, she very kindly contributed a section of photographs in there, some of which haven't
Yes.
appeared before.
Hmm.
So there's wonderful black and white photos, many of which from that time in New York in the mid '70s.
Hmm. Well, it's incredible the amount of the changes that you had in your life and how successful each one of those were. And because some people just stay with one thing, and when you knew when you were done with one thing and moved on to another. And so it's very inspiring. You're a very inspiring person. I mean, to look at your body of work, how did he accomplish all of this? You know what I mean? And I mean, people come here to self-actualize, but you also have to have the guts to
Mm.
self-actualize, you know?
Well, I think Maslow, I think he basically says, you need a certain courage, or I think Nietzsche says somewhere, what is the sort of like what's the common trait to humans? And it's like a toss up whether it's timidity or laziness, but it's somewhere like between between the two. But I mean, yeah, I mean, but again, someone asked me recently on a talk. They said, what would be my advice to someone, if they wanted to
Hmm.
do something similar, writing? And I first said, well, don't. It's a very unrewarding. It's a lot of work, jokingly. But I said, if you really want to do it, you have to make it your God. You have to make it that if you can't live if you don't do it. I mean, ego, sadly enough, comes a lot into this. I could not face myself if I did not actually, because this was something, and it took a long time. It took a long time. It took me, I said, it took me 10 years to start getting just book reviews published and then articles. But once that started happening, I wrote a lot to make up for lost time. I like nothing better than to see my name in print and something like that, So I
Yes.
mean, it's very gratifying and all that, and so yeah, I mean that's again, I mean, I I've been living here almost 30 years. I first started writing book reviews and things of that sort. I mean, when I was still working at this bookshop, the Bodhi Tree. That's one reason how I got into writing other things because I reviewed a wonderful book called The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas, and it's a fantastic sort of epic overview of the West from a kind of spiritually, or kind of from an archetypal. He was very influenced by Jung and Hillman and people like that and all that. But it was a brilliant book, and he came to the shop because he liked the review, and then he invited me to write for a journal he was editing, and so on and so on. So one thing led to another. But that was, say, 91. So that's more than 30 years ago now.
Yeah,
so I've been actually
34 years
writing
ago.
things more than 30. I started writing books. The
Yes.
first book contract was 98. So I've been, doing it for a long time. And sometimes that leads people to say, "My God, you've written so many books. Funny, I never heard of you." So how do you think I feel? It's like bands. It's like those bands that, they have to constantly tour. They tour and then they make enough money to make an album, and they have to go tour to promote the album to make enough money to tour again. So, but
Yes.
I have the great pleasure and joy of being able to do something I love doing,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoy doing it. And I think, if nowhere else, I think in the writing itself, I've some way grown or developed. I would like to think that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's the joy of life if you're able to do exactly what you love to do and make it your pastime, really. It's, I love it. It's been such a pleasure to be in your company again, the company of greatness. I know you probably don't feel that way, but to other people who aspire to even do half of what you've done. And
Well, my message to people is that you can do this too. There's no magic. There's no. I mean, that's all. When I saw those bands play ages ago, I said I can do that.
yes.
So so that was that's you can do it too. It takes a lot of work, but yeah, go for it. What do you got to lose?
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, but it's also a whole lot of fun as well. And for people like you and me as well, is that I enjoy the newness of things and digging in and being the best I can in whatever I do. And I think that's what you do. And it doesn't matter if you're writing books or whatever you're doing, is that you're feeling alive.
Absolutely.
Really, and that you're sharing your talent with others, because there's people that are going to become so inspired by what you do in your body of work to help them take those next steps that they need to do to self-actualize their own journey. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate you. It's so nice to be in your company again. And I've got many of your books on my bookshelf. Not all of them are read, but not yet, but I'm working at it. And so I thank you very much for joining me.
Well, absolutely my pleasure. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and being part of the journey with Nature of Consciousness, your host, Rhonda Grant. Theme song is composed and performed by John Park Wheeler.